Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So something that can be a little bit confusing and frustrating for people as they're progressing in their training is thinking about what their progress looks like over time. And most people have some understanding that when you're new to something like CrossFit, that you kind of get better at everything all at once, and it's very exciting, and your squat numbers go up, and you get better at doing pull-ups, and you get better at rowing, and it's just this, bonanza of gains, and it's all very thrilling, and at some point that's going to slow down. But once it has slowed down, it can be tricky for people to understand what progress looks like for people who are sort of past that beginner stage, more into the intermediate stage, more into the advanced stage. It can also be very frustrating for them because they feel like they're regressing, or they're not improving as quickly as they should be, or that they're having a hard time getting gains across multiple areas at once. And as coaches, when you see a wide variety of athletes and what progress looks like for people, then you can start to sort of pattern match and recognize like, whoa, this is a really messy process and it's very confusing, and people's performances will be kind of all over the place. So as a coach, it's easier, especially since it's not your own performance, to sort of detach from the numbers and the steady progress idea and recognize that sometimes things are going to be better, sometimes they're going to be worse, sometimes you're going to have a great day in the gym, other times you're not going to have a great day in the gym, and that people can get better in a way that doesn't always show in terms of like, oh, well, your squat improved and your rowing improved and your 30 muscle ups improved and your Fran time improved and you got better in the open all at once. Like, this is great. That coaches can see like it doesn't always work that way, but for athletes, it's much trickier. So I think that just having a discussion on what progress does actually look like and how non-linear it is might be helpful for some athletes to think about. And then also for some coaches just to understand that, they're not alone in seeing this sort of chaotic, messy way that athletes do actually progress over time. So Luke, I know you had some conversations about this recently. What did those conversations look like? Yeah,
so I think that when people start out, they'll sort of get a bit of an attachment to the numbers. And this is something that I experienced as well. And the people's thinking tends to be along the lines of, okay, I do the work and then all of a sudden I'm going to make improvements in said areas, and you can focus obviously on the areas that need more priority. But when people get into the sort of more intermediate and advanced stage, I think that improvement has to become seen to be a lot more. We have to start thinking about other things that aren't necessarily as measurable. So that could be movement quality, and that's going to be something that takes quite a long time. And especially if you have someone who is competing a lot, you have to look at progress a little bit more fluidly, and you have to be thinking about trying to make micro improvements and then also trying to maintain certain things constantly and having certain touches of different movements on throughout your training. With regards to the sort of the conversations I've had with progress with some of the athletes that I work with, it was mainly about trying to frame the idea of progress. Okay, so like, what are we trying to do with training? Because if someone has to be fairly clear at the start of like what they want to get, and I think that what ends up happening is people say, okay, I want to be a better athlete. I want to be more well-rounded. And then they have an attachment to certain numbers, and that they think that they are going to be able to push certain things up at the same time, where what we could actually be looking to do first is trying to amplify what you can currently do, trying to improve that, and then building a base for you to then make improvements in the future off of. Because if you've got certain things in your movement, in your technique that aren't necessarily efficient, then you're going to end up having roadblocks later on down the line. So I think that it's really important to understand and have a clear idea of what we are framing progress in. Are we framing it in the idea of the sort of competitive sphere, using sort of open workouts and data from that side of our training or of competing, or are we using actual training data? So are we trying to improve things like 10-minute assault bike, back squat numbers? And then we have to think about what is going to be the best plan to do that, because we need to use numbers to guide us, but they cannot be driving training forward. I think that it's an easy way to create buy-in with someone at the beginning of their sort of training is by getting them to focus on the training process, getting them to focus on trying to get certain things up, because that indicates that they are going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. But then also understanding that just because your abilities in cyclical tests goes up, that doesn't mean that your endurance in a mixed modal test is going to go up, because that's what you were being tested on. We can obviously increase the amount that your sort of awareness of pacing and your comfort on the rowing machine, which might help with workouts in the open, such as like 18.1, but improving your 5K time might not actually have a positive effect on a repeat of that workout. So I think it is really important that we understand the interplay with that, and then also the fact that the whole testing and the sport generally is very, very varied, and it's quite messy, and there's a huge grey area that I think that people sort of get into once they're in that intermediate to advanced stage. And I honestly think it's about trying to amplify what they can do, and then having constant and regular feedback from the athlete on what they feel like they need to be working on, because usually they're going to give you the best indication. It might be certain skills that they just are not comfortable with, and it's like, okay, we're just going to do a little bit more of that, and we're just going to turn the volume up a little bit on that, and then we're going to turn it down in this area. And it's just about trying to make those micro improvements consistently, especially with the more experienced athlete.
Yeah, Luke, I think that the idea of having an understanding of numbers but not becoming overly reliant on them is super important. And that can be difficult for people to really understand, because a number seems like such a tangible thing that's really indicative of your performance. And sure, we do have, like you mentioned, some key performance indicators for performance in a sport like CrossFit, right? That there's things that you want to know that can give you an idea of where someone sits. I mean, you mentioned some cyclical tests, probably some basic ideas of strength numbers as far as, power clean and front squat and back squat, maybe some gymnastics numbers, maybe like a 30 muscle ups for time, some repeatability tests. Like all these things are important, but the reality is, and you mentioned this especially with some of the cyclical stuff, is that improvements in those tests don't necessarily translate directly to improvement in the actual sport itself, especially in areas where, even testing repeatedly the same CrossFit workout, it's like, well, guess what? You're just getting better at pacing this workout. You're not necessarily getting better at the actual sport itself. Like, you're just doing this thing again, and you remembered exactly how it felt for your chest to bar pull-ups to go away. And so you paced appropriate to that and got a lot better. We see it every year in the open, right? People improve by like 10, 20% in 3 days just from being like, oh, I went too fast on the row. If I slow that down a little bit, I can increase my transition speed and just get, way more rounds done on this type of thing. So a lot of the improvement that we see just comes down to improvement in pacing and understanding of the actual test itself, and doesn't necessarily indicate actual improvement across the board in the sport. So it's very, very tricky to figure out what's actually going on there. And I think that can create some confusion for people, especially when that ability to just like improve by pacing better runs out too, similar to sort of like the newbie gains running out.
Yeah, like I think that what you have to be careful with as well is understanding that it's quite difficult sometimes, because it's going to be different for everyone, and we see this as coaches, and sometimes as coaches we don't necessarily have all of the answers, but what we can do is we can provide an objective view and try to guide someone through making progress based off of their feedback, making sure that they are able to maintain their fitness levels and their skill levels. And then just constantly looking at things, and it's an ongoing process. It's not clear cut. It's not necessarily going to be this very, very simple answer. And I think that a lot of people get caught up in this reductionist thinking, where they think that they can increase X, Y, and Z, and then all of a sudden they're going to become a better CrossFitter. I think one of the things I notice is that I, for instance, will put people through some form of testing who I don't necessarily have any knowledge of before they go through any training. But that's mainly just to look at areas of huge detriment, usually based off of conversations and just understanding, or just having a bit of an initial chat with them. The athlete will give valuable information about what they don't feel confident with and where they feel like they're falling short, and then looking at testing data and things like that, that does guide us, and that tells us if there's any huge areas that need a little bit more focus, and if there's something that's completely out of whack. Whereas I think a lot of people expect it to be like, oh, am I going through this testing period again in 3 months' time? And it's like, no, you're not, because you're going to be an emotional wreck when you do that. So we've just got to make it a little bit more fluid. And I think that it is, it's interesting, because when we first get into training, we sort of start to segment things, and we're like, okay, this is the 6-week block and this, that, and the other. And if you actually talk to people who are competing in the sport regularly, they train, they focus on what they need to improve. They do as their coach or their program says. There's usually sort of like little attachment to the actual program, and they just operate when they're in the gym, and then it's working to the next competition and taking a bit of downtime, and it becomes a lot more of a fluid process. And that progression is going to be, you're going to see that from a little bit more of like a 30,000 foot view, as opposed to, we're going to work a block of this and then you're going to see this result. So I think that it's usually a bit of a struggle when people have to sort of get over that idea, that they're not necessarily going to be working in things as in a little bit as much of a linear fashion, and something that's as easy to conceptualize as that.
And I think for a lot of people, that's excuse me, that's the big thing, that it's managing expectations. And as coaches, it's easy for us to kind of pull away and say, well, yeah, I'm not expecting you to just add, 15 pounds to your back squat every time we retest it. But to an athlete, it's sometimes hard to get away from that feeling of constantly looking at the data. I mean, the nature of CrossFit is very data driven. It's very obvious where improvements are made when you make an improvement. But sometimes it's not as obvious, like you were mentioning, Todd, understanding, improving pacing and using a different strategy to improve your result doesn't necessarily mean you're a better athlete in the last 3 days. It just means you changed up the way you approach something. But I think being able as a coach to pull people out of that mindset of everything has to improve all the time, and being able to look at the bigger picture, like you were saying, Luke, it's not just the straight numbers. It's not just that, well, I ran through this snatch cycle and I didn't PR my snatch at the end of it. It's like, well, yeah, that's okay. What did you improve on from that? And being able to relay that as a coach to make sure that people understand that it's not just been a wasted training cycle. They've made improvements, even if they haven't got the immediate tangible, PRs or anything like that.
I also think that it's important to reiterate not just the variation in day-to-day performance, which I think we've talked about plenty on this podcast, right? That just on a daily basis, you're going to be plus or minus a certain percentage point based upon how you feel and any number of other factors. But that also people will tend to have quote unquote breakthroughs and then kind of regress, right? So like they will get better and then they'll kind of like fall back to where they were previously and then potentially improve again to that quote unquote next level, right? So people kind of have this sort of like micro up and down messiness in their day-to-day results of just like, yep, okay, your 2K time is going to be plus or minus this percentage. Your back squat is going to be plus or minus this percentage. Your time on any sort of combination of thrusters and double unders is going to be plus or minus this percentage. And then you may suddenly put it all together and actually get better as an athlete, right? Quote unquote, level up, which we'll see where suddenly someone does something where you're like, that is a lot better than you normally are on something like that, right? And it's like, oh, that's exciting. You made a quote unquote breakthrough, but then they'll fall back. It's not like they're now, whatever. Oh, now I'm this level of athlete. Now I can squat this much. Now I can do CrossFit this quickly. That they'll have a taste of that and then fall back to where they were. And then that for them, to your point, John, creates a huge psychological problem because their expectations are now totally out of alignment. It's like, no, I can row at 1,400 calories per hour on all my workouts now because I did it on this one. And then they're sort of like caught up in trying to hit this new pace all the time that they were able to sustain based upon everything sort of being in the right place at the right time. And then that becomes difficult for them when they're not able to do that consistently. But we see it in other sports as well that are less sort of messy. So I think it is important to potentially bring in some ideas from track and field and marathon running to sort of like give an outside perspective on this, right? That in CrossFit, where we have all these different workouts and people are not always doing the same thing in the same situation, so there's a lot more learning that goes with it. But in, track and field or a marathon, it's like you kind of know exactly what's going to happen, right? You're going to run this distance, which you've run over and over and over again. And what you'll see there is similarly, athletes will have these sort of breakthrough performances where they'll do like a significant percentage improvement on their previous best, and then they'll fall back right to where they were, right? So it's sort of like a standard regression to the mean type of situation where it's like, well, you had this outlier performance and now you're back where you were, and then they may never actually touch that again. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do kind of like level up to that next level at some point, but other times they don't. And there is some somewhat controversial, I guess, theory in terms of breakthrough performances like that, where a lot of it just has to do with like, how many shots do you take at running a 5K? How many shots do you take at running a marathon? And that once you kind of get past that sort of like a intermediate level progression, that it's just like you keep taking shots at it, and then some days you put it all together and you have an incredible performance. And I don't know enough about the sport to really have a strong opinion on that, but I do think that is an interesting perspective where it's like it's not necessarily about actually getting better, it's just about taking a lot of attempts, because the day-to-day variation in performance based upon any number of confusing factors. And if you have more attempts, you have a better shot at actually putting it all together and having one of those sort of special days where everything goes right for you. So, that's a different sport, but I think it's relevant just to understand that it's not always going to be progression in the way that we think. It's going to be this kind of like day-to-day messiness, sudden touches on a new level, then falling back, then maybe actually leveling up later on. And that if an athlete expects that, they might not become as psychologically traumatized by not being able to hold their same row pace that they held before, and then that can prevent them from sort of exacerbating any sort of issue that they're experiencing because they're not where they thought they should be.
Yeah, and I think you see this with like the elite level CrossFitters who are going to the games like year in, year out. Like the leaderboard is constantly changing. The workouts are always different, and you can see that they're experiencing the changes and those fluctuations in their performance. And I think that when people do start getting into CrossFit, I think that there needs to be some level of buy-in and appreciation for structure and certain things that they're trying to achieve within their training. And I think that's good because it gives people something to focus on as they are training, especially if they're not competing regularly. But as they get further into that, and as it becomes a lot more grey, I think that if you are competitive, your focus needs to be more on being comfortable and being able to, do more tasks and achieve better results in competitions over a period of time, and a little bit less on getting attached to numbers and trying to force improvement. If you try and force improvement or try and force that progress, that's where it gets really tricky, because you can waste a lot of time doing that. And it sometimes it takes sort of going through that learning curve and sort of essentially wasting a bit of time in your training, trying to do something that you feel that you should be able to. But then you also have to probably look at it a little bit from more of a deeper psychological angle as well, as being like, okay, well, why should you have to do this? And, where your motivation is coming from. And what you see quite often in CrossFit is that people just compare themselves to people that they sort of are in their network or, in their training group or something like that. And they see progress happening with other people at a different rate. And guess what? They're different people. They got different mums and dads. It's not going to happen exactly at the same rate for you. So,
how often as coaches do you guys kind of manage expectations just by shifting focus within training or testing? So I know for myself, I will sometimes avoid having some people test out on a lift or on a certain thing we've been working on, because I know, given their performances in the last 10 days, or given some lifetime struggles they've been having where, maybe they've been more stressed at work or they've been sleeping less, things like that, I know they're not going to have the progress they expect to have. So I will then maybe take out a testing piece or alter it slightly to avoid that feeling of failure.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely pulled way back from the sort of like standard test retest protocols that I used to follow, right? Luke, I think you mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but that, you know, the way you sort of learn to program is like, okay, we're going to test all this stuff. Then we'll use a row as an example. We're going to test your 2K row, and then we're going to do rowing repeats of these 500 meter intervals with a certain amount of rest. We're going to gradually increase the pace over time, and then we're going to retest the 2K. And we're going to see where you're at. Then we're going to do it again. And we're going to change your paces. Then we're going to retest the 2K and just like keep going like that. And I've definitely learned that, number one, it's just not that simple for people in terms of actually creating improvement, especially for more advanced athletes. But number two, John, to your point, is that people have a very negative reaction to being tested over and over like that they get very stressed out about the test itself. And then, especially if the results don't go the way that they want them to, can really get down on themselves in a way that is not necessarily productive or helpful. So I don't even necessarily look at it as far as like, oh, you're having a hard time recently, so we're not going to retest this. I just kind of pulled back from testing like that in general, because I find that it isn't as helpful to me as a coach, since I can kind of use other metrics or create sort of like similar tests to sort of see where people are without just retesting the same thing over and over again that people are going to have that psychological attachment to and fixation on the result. And to sort of use testing like that more on purpose in order to prepare people for the difficulty of having to do something that they know they should get a certain score on, right? That I sort of think about testing now as like, this is something that's going to be psychologically difficult for you. So we're going to use it in order to create that psychologically difficult scenario, rather than using it as creating whatever data for myself to understand where an athlete is at. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, I think I use sort of like an initial testing structure, which has always varied a little bit on individual to individual. And this is usually with people I just don't have like an awareness of how they move and stuff like that. I've worked with some clients in person, and then they've sort of gone in and end up working with me remotely, and there's really like no need to do it. But yeah, I've veered away from giving people the sort of the idea that they are retesting something, and even then, like I would sort of, similar to how you were saying, John, is that if I know that they're going through certain things that are going to affect their training and their results, and they might not necessarily have the sort of desired results, I'd probably also avoid building up to or using training pieces which are probably going to affect how they feel about their performance, whereas I'll make things a lot more training-esque as opposed to build up to a heavy double, single, triple of this, that, and the other, or, you know, writing sort of typical CrossFit workouts, or writing anything that's sort of similar to something that they might have done before. Yeah, just because I think that the goal is making sort of those micro improvements over a long period of time, and what you need for that is a motivated athlete, someone that is sort of bought into the process. And I think that, yeah, like you said, John, if someone isn't going to be performing too well for whatever reasons on something, that can really just mess with them psychologically, and just cause them to be a bit disgruntled.
And to that point, do you guys ever give people stuff just to make them feel good, where it's like, you're probably going to crush this, so let's try this, just so you're feeling like, oh yeah, I'm really good at fitness?
Yeah, I think I probably have. I don't think it's all about crushing everyone all the time. I think that there's an element of, you have to. I've usually giving people like a like a throwdown piece every week, and then if I've got some people of a sort of similar level, they might be going through something similar. But generally, I know that when I'm writing that, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's going to be really good for that person. Okay, cool. They're having their treat for the month, or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that's usually quite good as well.
And I have some people, sorry, Tom. I was just going to say, I have some people who I will do kind of standard retesting with, because I see what their results are coming up in training, and I see what kind of progress they're making. And I know, like, yeah, they're going to have improved on this. And I want them to realize that and get the, that kind of emotional boost from having improved.
Yeah, and I think that leading into a competition, it can also be valuable to give people something that makes them feel not necessarily like, oh, I've improved on this in particular, but that I'm ready to go, right? That I feel really good about this. Because I think that as coaches, or at least for myself, I know that I can sort of be like, all right, this is what you need to work on. So we're just going to do this all the time. So you're spending a lot of time doing stuff that you're bad at, which, most athletes are bought into that, who really want to improve, but that can be challenging for them to just always be like, yep, working on strict handstand push-ups again, really struggling. This is hard. Not so good. And that just doing that over and over again can make them feel like they're not any good at the sport, even though they might be. So that there's a combination leading into more competitive periods in the season where we probably want them to do some stuff that's going to challenge them in terms of like, okay, I have to be prepared to do something where my score counts and I have a number in my head and I'm going to potentially be disappointed. And how do I react to that? As well as I'm going to do something that makes me feel like, oh, I'm actually really pretty good at this.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it was like Roy Jones Jr. His trainer used to make him do just like bodybuilding before he would go into a fight or something like that, just so he could just like look at his muscles and feel good about himself before he got in the ring. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, bicep veins really coming in, ready for this.
It's going to be really effective with that overhand.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.